Hello and welcome back to another episode of the On the Sideline podcast with Jackson and Kyle. I am Jackson and I am joined here, as always, by a man who is very upset that we will not be talking about Dak Prescott this week. Kyle, how are you holding up?
Surviving despite that heartbreaking news. I was ready. I had another 2 hours on him. So
yes. Well, maybe for another podcast, we can do our 2-hour Dak Prescott review. I mean, listen, I made a 2-hour Derek Carr video, so I guess I shouldn't talk too much. But yeah, so if you missed our podcast last week, what we're doing is we're doing a deep dive for each team, and we're doing it by divisions. And last week we did the NFC East. Now we're moving on to the NFC North. Interesting division here. I think a lot of should be some fun stuff to talk about.
Yeah, it is. So as I said last week, my super complex formula for ranking all the divisions, I had the NFC East as the worst division in football, mainly because I felt like there wasn't any real Super Bowl contenders I felt in that division, and that the Redskins also brought it down because they're a potential number one pick team. This division, the NFC North, I actually have right smack in the middle. I have them as the fourth best division in football. And that is because I do feel like the big thing that the NFC North, I think, has going for them is that I don't have any teams listed as a number one pick contender. I don't think any of these teams are going to be the worst team in football. You could argue potentially the Lions. I just think even with the coach, as we're going to talk about, there's too much talent in that Lions locker room. And I went back and forth. The other three teams, I think that are all definitely playoff potential teams. And I did put the Vikings as a Super Bowl contender. So we'll get into all that. But yeah, this is the fourth best division in football for me, and I think there's a lot of good talent in this division.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And so let's just get into it, and we'll So if you missed last week, the way we do it is that Kyle is going to rank each team in each division worst to best. He will pick one, and I sort of rank each position grouping on a scale of 1 to 10, and I give them total scores. So Kyle, who do you have as finishing last in the NFC North?
All right, so I feel like this was kind of a no-brainer for a lot of people. I do think that this team, like I just said earlier, has, a good amount of talent on it. I don't think it's actually one of the worst teams in football, but it has one of the worst coaching staffs in football, I think. So I'm going to put the Detroit Lions right now at number 4. I do think that this is a team in the next couple of years could be pretty competitive, but right now I do think that the fourth, with how competitive this division is, they are the fourth team in it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we'll get into when I sort of break this down is I feel like in terms of the Lions, their only weakness is coaching. I feel like I don't think they have a definite weakness all across the board. You could argue one position group that we'll get into, but for the most part, I think that there is a lot of good here, and I think that that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot because of the bad. Matt Patricia, of course, is he was listed. He ended up being the 32nd he was on 32nd on my coaching. On my list of top coaches. So he gets a 1. I mean, that's kind of an obvious 1 out of 10 for Matt Patricia.
Yeah, I do think that of the experienced coaches, obviously, I try to temper my expectations for rookie coaches and even one-year head coaches, which is Patricia to an extent. But I do feel like overall he is one of the worst coaches of football. And I feel like, this could be a situation where he's out by week 6, because I just think that this team shouldn't be like an 0-16 by week 6, but if they are, he's definitely gone. And it's going to be interesting to see what exactly saves Matt Patricia's job this season, given everything that's happened and the whole Darius Slay situation. What saves his job?
Yeah, I mean, I could see a situation where the Lions make the playoffs and Patricia gets fired. I could see that happening too. I think that in the realm of possibilities, I think that exists. Maybe we can touch a little bit more on him at the end. Quarterback, this was kind of an easy one. Stafford, he gets an 8. I guess not, super easy, but obviously he's going to get a high grade. He gets an 8 here. I mean, there's not too much better than Stafford, but there is a little better than him. So 8 feels right for me here. And then also for the offensive line, you have center Frank Ragnow, who's a good center, I believe. Their guard play with I'm not even going to try to pronounce. You know who I'm talking about? His first name.
Vitae, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for bailing me out there. Yeah. And then Joe Dow. You have you also have Kenny Wiggins as a guard, and then you have Taylor Decker and Tyrell Crosby for their tackles. O-line, it's what I like about the O-line is I don't know if they have too many weaknesses. I'm not sure if they have a ton of strengths either, but I like their O-line. I'm going to give their O-line a 6.
Yeah, I do feel like Stafford is a high level quarterback. You're getting one of the best arm talents in the league anytime he plays. I do think he's really talented. He's going to be a top 10 quarterback for the majority of his career. And I think Chase Daniel is always going to be a pretty high level backup. It seems like everywhere he goes, they really like him in the locker room. They really like what he can do and come in a pinch. And now he's on the Lions with that situation. The the offensive line's interesting. I think there are a lot of good pieces here. I do think there is kind of a weakness, though, with Vaitai. I do think that he's probably a step below, I think, some of the other guys on the left side of that line. And then we're going to see what happens, Jonah Jackson coming in and how he can do on that right side of the line as well. But I do think it's a solid offensive line overall, so I'd agree with that.
Okay, sounds good. And then from that, we'll move on to the wide receivers. The wide receivers I find very fascinating because Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay are probably the two most underrated, like 1-2 punches and like the most underrated duo in football. I think they're two really good receivers. I think. Then for the number 3 guy, you have a bit of a question mark. I mean, Amendola has proven he can be a number 3 in the past. I don't think that he's a bad number 3. You also have Geronimo Allison. But again, I think this receiving core is probably underrated. I'm going to give this receiving core a 7.
Yeah, I really like this receiving core too. I think, Jones, I think, is really talented. He is one of the most frustrating fantasy football players I think ever, but he's an incredibly talented wide receiver. Galladay is a big time player, and finding him after the whole Calvin Johnson situation is a great thing for Detroit happened to Detroit. And I like Amendola. Obviously, he did a lot for my team, came up big time with big time plays, and I really like Quintez Cephas, who they got in the draft. He's a really shifty, smart route runner that I think is going to have an impact his rookie year as well. So I do like this receiving core. I'd probably go a 7 or an 8.
Yeah. And for those of you listening to your first podcast, Kyle is a diehard Dolphins fan. Big fan of Amendola back when he was on the Dolphins. So that's what he's talking about. Moving on to the backs now. Again, backs are halfbacks and fullbacks. They have Nick Bodden. Who cares? He's their fullback. And then for the halfbacks, you have DeAndre Swift, rookie that drafted in the second round last year. Many thought could have gone in the first round. He goes in the second. Kerryon Johnson, who is typically very good for 4 games a year. And also, I'll give some love to Bo Scarborough, who I actually thought played pretty decently well when he, after everyone got injured and he had to come in and play. So I think their backs are good. I don't think their backs are anything spectacular necessarily. I mean, again, Swift could end up being that. There is question marks there. There's question marks with Johnson's injury history. I'm giving them a 6 here. I think it's above average, but nothing spectacular.
Yeah, I probably would go 5 for now, mainly because I want to see Swift before he plays. I really like, the thing was with Swift, like especially when Travis Etienne decided to go back to college, he was essentially regarded as the most complete back coming out because he can do a lot of things. He did a lot of pass protection and catching the ball out of the backfield with Jake Fromm because he didn't have the big arm. He's a good running back behind a good offensive line, had productive numbers in the SEC, which is as comparable to the NFL as you can get. So I think that that's a guy who can be very good. I just want to see it first. And I've always been one of those guys that's like, wow, I really like what Kerryon Johnson can do. And then by the time I really like what he's doing, he's out. So, he is getting hurt. So that's a big problem. And I do feel like he might end up being a trade candidate here because he can't stay healthy. And if a guy like Swift pans out to the way we expect, plus Scarborough as that goal line guy because he's that bigger body, I do feel like Johnson could eventually be that trade candidate. But I like the 3 guys overall. That's a nice combination. And I think a 6 or a 5 is probably fine until I see Swift.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I won't fight you on one point. Yeah, I think that I think Bo Scarborough just has the coolest name in maybe the coolest name in sports. Bo Scarborough doesn't get better than that. Let's move on to the tight ends here. Tight ends I find interesting because I think last year we thought this could maybe be the best tight end group in football, or at least up there. It is not. At least it wasn't last year. Jesse James, it seemed like he did take somewhat of a step back. He wasn't atrocious last year, but I feel like he had his better years in Pittsburgh. And you also have TJ Hawkinson, who had one great game, didn't really show much else after that. But at the same time, he was a rookie, and rookie tight ends typically don't do too well. Also worth noting, in his one great game against Arizona, Arizona ended up being the team that was the worst against tight ends that year. So that probably factored in. So I'm gonna give this. I'm going to give this a 6. I still think it's above average because I think there's the potential there. And again, part of it is like I'm not really trying to predict how I think they're going to do. I'm just saying if I think there's a 50-50 shot, they end up being the best duo in the league, and a 50-50 shot, they're terrible, then I would give them a 5. I try to, even it out that way. So I think that there's a chance to end up as like an 8. There's a chance to end up as like a 3 or 4. So I'm going to give them a 6 here.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I think one of the things, so like you said, rookie tight ends tend to struggle out of the gate because there's a lot that they're asked to do early on. I think Hawkinson definitely showed that he has the talent to be a really productive tight end in the NFL. And then the other thing, Jesse James, it was his worst tight end season since his rookie year. And a lot of that could be, he's going into a new offense for the first time. There's probably an adjustment period there as well. So that probably affected his game a little bit. I do think that this is a high ceiling tight end group because those two can be very good. And I do think that eventually Hawkinson will take that leap forward and be the prospect that we all kind of expected.
Yeah, I agree. And so as a whole, their offense, solid, gets a 6.6 here. So good, nothing spectacular, but significantly above average. And we can move on to their defense. We'll go to the edge rushers, and I'm going to throw Trey Flowers in as an edge rusher. You could argue he's an interior defensive lineman. I gave him edge rusher because I think that he tends to play more of his snaps on the edge, although he can play anywhere, as we know. The problem is that there is kind of a question mark outside of that. You have Julian Okwara, who they drafted in the 3rd round. They also have Austin Bryant, who was a 4th round pick last year, who came in and didn't really show much of anything, but rookie. And then you also have Christian Jones. Who cares? So the one thing is that, let's be real, Matt Patricia doesn't like to really use the edge rushers in a traditional sense, but I grade them all the same. I'm going to give them a 5, largely because I think Trey Flowers is still very good. He was one of the few guys who came over from New England to Detroit and still played well for Detroit. And then I think that, they have a 3rd round pick. He could end up being a solid starter, or he could end up sucking. I think that 5 feels right for me here.
Yeah, I do think that, Trey Flowers on his own could potentially be, like, if you're grading the individual player, is the 8 or 9 level. The question for the Lions is going to be if they're going to get any production, out of the Okwara brothers, whether they get, 2018 production out of Romeo, where he was at least serviceable on that side. And so he needs a big bounce back season, or his brother could step up and be big for them. But I do think that, Trey Flowers does bring this group up, and he holds this group up to a higher standard.
I didn't realize they were brothers. I thought that they were just 2 guys that happened to have an incredibly uncommon last name. That was bad job by me putting that together, I guess.
Are they not brothers? I mean, they both went to Notre Dame. I kind of just assumed.
No, I mean, they probably are. I just sort of never put that together. Which it makes sense. They're both named Okwara. I guess they both went to the same college. Yeah, no, they probably are. I just didn't realize that because I'm dumb. But yeah, I think we've said enough about the edge rushers. Move on to the interior defensive line. We'll go with you have Nick Williams, Deshaun Hand, and Danny Shelton from New England. I think that this is a good interior defensive line. I feel like, Danny Shelton, again, it's like, how many guys from New England end up panning out with another team? Some do, some don't. But, these are guys who have shown flashes. All of them, I'm going to give them a 6. Again, it's kind of like I feel like they're maybe slightly above average, but I still don't know if I'm ready to give them anything better than that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Even, I thought Shelton was good last year, but I feel like sometimes he wanes in and out of the plays. I thought Adam Butler by the end of the year was I preferred him at defensive tackle a lot more by the end of the year compared to Shelton. So I think he's okay, but I think that's a pretty solid option. And, we're going to see what these guys can do. I don't think this is any like game breaking defensive tackle group, but they're solid, and, they're going to clog up the lanes up the middle.
Yeah, I will have to say, I don't know if they're good enough to be in this Matt Patricia defense that likes to just rush 3 a ton. I don't know if they're quite at that level, but when they do that, they'll probably have Flowers be one of the guys who is rushing. So that could help change things. We'll also go to the linebackers that aren't edge rushers. So this is in a 3-4, it's middle linebackers. In a 4-3, it's linebackers or outside linebackers. Right here, you have Jamie Collins, who another guy brought in from New England, and also Jelani Tavai, 2nd round pick. who I thought was actually showed a lot last year. I thought that he got a lot of people didn't like the pick when he was drafted, but I think he really showed them wrong. Had a very good rookie season. They also brought in Reggie Ragland from Kansas City, who I think should easily be a solid number 3 guy at least. So I like the linebacking core. Again, we'll have to see about Jamie Collins. I mean, let's be real. He's someone who has had some concerns about how much does he really care about it. And now that he's gotten paid, how much effort is he really going to put in? But I still give them a 7 here.
Yeah, I think that the one thing this linebacking group has going for them is depth, because I think a guy like Jared Davis is even a serviceable guy at that position. But it's not going to be any higher because I don't think there's any like real stars in this area, and it's going to be impossible to expect Collins to put up any production similar to what he does in New England. So I'm not really expecting it because it's just, the New England style and what he does there just doesn't translate anywhere else, even if it's a Matt Patricia defense. The way he can kind of freelance in New England and get away with it, he's not going to be able to get away with any defense. So I do think that a 5 or a 6 is probably where they're at.
Okay, well, I mean, I maybe I'm just a little bit higher on Tavai than you are, then, which is why I gave them the 7. But fair enough. I do think Tavai, I do believe Tavai could potentially be a star. Not saying he's going to, but he has that potential. But anyways, we'll move on to the last category, the secondary. You have Jeffrey Okudah, who they just drafted. They also brought in Desmond Trufant. Seems like those will be the number 1 and 2 corners. You also have Akurie and Coleman, who should add some depth there. And then for the safeties, it's a little bit more interesting. You have another former Patriot, Devon Harmon. You also have Tracy Walker and Will Harris, who was a 3rd-round pick last year. Wasn't spectacular last year, but maybe still has potential. As a whole, I'm going to give their secondary an 8. I still trust their cornerback grouping. Listen, I think Harmon is good. I don't know if he's again, there's always that question mark, but I think this is an 8.
Yeah, I think the problem with Harmon is that we really just, he's an experienced guy, but we really just haven't seen him play like a really important role. For the Patriots, he was always that 3rd safety or kind of, as a pseudo slot guy. And now he's going to be expected to just take the role that Pat Chun has done all these years in New England and just apply it to almost what he does in Detroit. And he just wasn't a starter all that much in New England, where, you question whether or not he can be good enough to actually be that. But it'll be interesting to see what he can do and what the level is going to be where he's at. I like the rest of the secondary overall. I was really high on Okudah coming out. I think he's a future shutdown guy. I don't think Trufant is obviously Darius Slay, which is a downgrade, but I think he's good enough to be a solid guy, and he can start at that number 1 corner until they feel like Okudah's that guy, and then move him over to that number 2 corner. And, the one thing Trufant always does is he creates turnovers. So that's, I don't think he's perfect, but he does do that really well. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think in hindsight, maybe I was a little bit too high on this just because, Okudah's a rookie, and I think you brought up good points about Harmon, but I'll keep it at 8 for now. So this gives their defense 6.5. Meaning that total for the Lions, they have a 6.6 offense, a 6.5 defense, but with their coach, this brings their total down to 6.0.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I guess the first question is, do you think Matt Patricia survives the season?
No, I don't. I think that I would say maybe like I'll say less than 10% chance he survives. I think that the way that he has to, I mean, maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on it. I definitely want to keep him. I think the only way he does survive is if this talent sort of wins out. The talent is able to get them to a playoff spot, and then the front office says, well, hey, he got to a playoff spot. Let's keep him here. So I guess there is a chance, but I'll say around like 10% chance he survives.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the problem is that, the coaches you tend to see get fired early are the teams that are completely out, whether it's 1 or 2 wins. Or 0 wins, and they're trying to get ahead of the coaching search and get the guy first. I just feel like at the same time, I don't think this Lions team is bad enough to be 2-10. We went through their roster. They have so many big time players. I don't think this roster is bad enough to be like 2-10 halfway through the season, or That's 3/4 of the way to the season. Sorry. But, or even like, a 1-7 is my problem. So I could see a situation where they're 6-10 and Patricia's fired at the end of the year, because this really should be a 8-8, 9-7, maybe a 10-6 team at their very best with a good coach, but they just don't have a good coach.
Yeah. I think that my prediction on how this is going to go is that their Lions are going to miss the playoffs again. And then they're going to hire someone else. And we could see like a Jeff Fisher to Sean McVay situation where there's a talented team that Fisher just doesn't know what he's doing. And so then they're able to immediately make the playoffs if a rookie head coach. I could see something like that happening very easily. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think the only reason Patricia is even still here is because the Lions didn't love any of the potential coaches they could have gotten and said, well, let's just keep him for one more year so we can have a better opportunity to get a better guy the following year. Yeah. And we can kind of show that, hey, we're loyal to you. We'll give you opportunities.
So you heard it here first. Lincoln Riley to Detroit. Congratulations, Lions fans.
That's right.
Get ready for that. That'll be fun to see. All right.
Yes, exactly. Let's just go ahead. Unless you have anything else to add about the Lions, let's move on to who do you have at the number 3 team? So the Bears. We move on to Bears.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I feel like this is a very straightforward division for me. You could talk me into the Packers over the Vikings. I just feel like the Vikings have a better roster. But the Bears have a very good roster as well compared to the rest of the league. And I really like a lot of the players they have. The issue is that their biggest question is the most important position in football. And that's why they're going to be number 3. And I think that's pretty much going to be the consensus is their third because of that. So number 3 in this division, Chicago Bears.
Okay, well, interesting, because I don't totally agree, but we can get into that a little bit later about what your exact criticism is. I think the Bears are maybe the most lopsided team in terms of where their talent is, with their talent on defense and not on offense. But we'll just get into it. So first, their coach, Matt Nagy. Again, what I did for coaches and quarterbacks was I just took it straight from, I said for top 3, 1 through 3 on my quarterback rankings, they get 10. And then 4 through 6, they get 9. And this went down all the way down the list. There was 5 that got a 5. Matt Nagy gets a 4. And then Nick Foles gets a 1 because he finished bottom 3 in my quarterback rankings. What do you think about those 2 scores?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Nagy is going to be kind of a we'll see. I think that he's shown that he could be a pretty solid coach. I do think that if you compare Trubisky and Foles together, if we're ranking backup quarterbacks as well, I think that brings it up into the room a little bit, brings it up a little higher, because I do think that one of them is going to be a pretty high level backup to whoever's starting. The question is that both of them are probably low tier, bottom level starters in my book.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue they get a 2, but I don't think you could really argue much higher than that. Yeah. Fair enough. One thing I do want to say about Foles, though, is that I actually do think Foles has talent. He just needs to be in a specific system, and that is not what they have going for Chicago. So I just think it's a terrible fit more than anything. And so I'm kind of evaluating him on how I think he'll run this system, which is not very well. Their O-line, I'm also not a huge fan of. They have James Daniels and Cody Whitehair, who I'm a fan of both of those guys. I think they're both good. But then that's kind of where my fandom ends of this offensive line. You have Rashad Coward for the other guard, and then tackles are Charles Leno and Bobby Massey. Not really a lot to write home about. I think that, especially when you only have 2 good offensive linemen, you don't want them to be your center and one of your guards as well. This is not a great offensive line for me. I'm giving them a 3 out of 10.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think that interior is going to be solid, but of course, if a guy like Ifedi finds his way into the fold, I do think he's, one of the worst starting linemen I think I've seen over the last couple of years. But I do think that, I think that's fair. This is a pretty bad offensive line in my book, but I do think that there's talent on this offense elsewhere, just not at this position.
Okay, well, we'll keep going then. Wide receivers. I need to start a free Allen Robinson campaign, because I do think Allen Robinson is probably the best player on this offense. I think he's very underrated. But again, I kind of feel like that's kind of where it ends to some degree. I like Anthony Miller. I don't love Anthony Miller. I don't really see him as the number 2 guy. Ted Ginn Jr., again, fine. Javon Wims, not really anything special. I think the wide receiving grouping is just slightly below average. I think it's a 4.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably boost it for a 5. I think I'm a little higher on Anthony Miller than you. I think he can actually be a pretty good number 2 guy. And I think Robinson, if you look at a lot of metrics, Robinson's actually like a top 6 or 7 level receiver almost. Maybe not that high, but he's in that upper echelon of receivers almost to that level. And I think he can be at that level. The problem is that he's got our one rated quarterback room throwing to him here. I do think that there is talent here, but I think the problem is that there's also not a lot of depth. I don't trust a lot of the guys behind. Their fourth receiver is essentially Cordarrelle Patterson, who's been essentially a zero his entire life. That's not true. He's a good returner. But great returner. But if you're lining him up as your number 2 receiver due to a few injuries, you're in trouble. So I would say probably a 5 because I do like that 1-2 combo. I think Robinson is a high level guy, but the offense and what they do for him doesn't help the cause.
Okay, well, fair enough. I won't argue a 1-point difference. And move on to the backs here. So basically, the 2 backs are David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen. Montgomery was the guy who everyone on all of the fantasy football Reddit were going crazy about. This guy is going to be the guy you want to make sure you draft. Didn't quite work out that way. They also have Tariq Cohen, of course. I think a large part of some of their struggles last year, not even struggled, but just not doing spectacular last year, was because the offensive line just took a huge drop off. But that being said, again, this isn't something that you could argue me into a 5 here. I feel like this is, again, a 4. I think it's slightly below average. You look at the average team. And plus, there is a plethora of good running backs right now. So I feel like it's kind of a little bit inflated. There's some guys who I might feel like should be like a number 7, but actually kind of end up being a 5 just because of how much talent there is. They get a 4 for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think that Montgomery has a pretty high ceiling, I think. But of course, we have to see it. And of course, behind this offensive line, that's going to be tough. I do think he's talented, though. I think Tariq Cohen's kind of the modern-day Tavon Austin, where everyone likes the idea of him, but isn't really sure how to actually deploy a guy like that into an offense. So I do think that, he's a nice tool to have, but you don't really know what to do with him. I think it's the problem. But I think he's solid. As a number 2 guy, we'll see. I do feel like this could potentially be a Raheem Mostert spot. If we're going into the NFL news, I do feel like this is a spot where he could end up and kind of be that second guy, because I don't think Tariq Cohen's good enough to be that guy.
Yeah, well, we know the Bears not afraid to give up draft picks if they think they have to. I think that, I could see that. Yeah, I think the problem with Cohen is just that, like, he's just not great at the actual running the football part. Like, that's where he sort of struggles, and he's so good as sort of this gadget player type guy. But at the end of the day, if teams see you out there and they feel like, okay, this is probably a pass, that's not a good thing. So it kind of can give away a lot of what you're doing, which just again, he has some value, of course, but I don't know how much his value is. So they get a 4 there. And then for tight ends, take your pick as to which tight ends you want to talk about. At one point, they had 10 tight ends on their roster. They've now cut it down to 9 tight ends on their roster. The 2 biggest names are Jimmy Graham and Demetrius Harris. They're giving Jimmy Graham an absurd amount of money for no real reason. They also drafted Cole Kmet in the 2nd round. It seems like he's probably going to end up being the guy who they want to be their starter. But despite this plethora of tight ends, I still feel like there's not anyone who I think is going to be great this year in 2020. Again, we've talked about rookie tight ends not doing too well. And considering the fact that it seems like he's going to be their number 1 guy, for me, this is a 2.
Yeah, they have so many guys at tight end, but so much junk almost. Right. I almost want to say. I don't think Jimmy Graham's going to last 16 games as a starter. I don't think he was good last year. And I don't see him getting better or getting back to his old ways. He's another guy where it's like, oh, if we could just get New Orleans Saints Jimmy Graham, it's going to be okay. Well, he hasn't been New Orleans Saints Jimmy Graham in 5 years. And he was abysmally bad last year. I do think there's a potential for a guy like Kmet to kind of break the tight end mold for rookies, because I think he's going to be used predominantly as a receiver because he is so huge. And he was, I think he's a great athlete, that he's going to be more split out a little bit and not to do as much of the blocking assignments, especially early on until he develops that part of him. So I do think he could have a good year receiving wise. Tight end wise, I don't see him being much of a blocker. I do think he's develops that early, later on and becomes a very good tight end overall. But I could see him having a good year pass catching wise, especially without a clear cut number 3 option in this offense for catching.
Yeah, and luckily they can just use Jimmy Graham for all the blocking assignments.
Yeah, great time blocker.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
They have 8 tight ends. They got to figure out somebody who can block.
Yeah, you would think someone could be able to figure it out. Yeah, so the offense, not great. I have them, their total score comes to a 2.8. Definitely not a very high score for their offense. And however, luckily for the Bears, there's more to football than just offense, because their defense gets a lot better. And we'll start with the edge rushers, Khalil Mack and Robert Quinn. It's a 10. I mean, you don't have to, Khalil Mack, Robert Quinn. Okay, you get a 10.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. Breaking news, Khalil Mack and Robert Quinn are really good at football. That's going to be a big thing. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the best edge rushing group in football. Those are two, potentially game-changing guys at that position. And there's not that much like you'd say. I think that the Khalil Mack had a step back thing was a little overblown. They had a few injuries, and obviously that prevented him from having as big of numbers as he did. But with Robert Quinn on the other side, they're not going to be able to put all the attention on Mack, or else Quinn's going to have a monster season. So yeah, it's a 10.
Yeah, and I mean, Mack's never been that insane sack guy too. He's just the kind of guy who on a select parts of games will just completely take over them. So yeah, I think we're both in agreement there. Interior defensive line, maybe the biggest reason their defense kind of took a step back last year was because of the Akeem Hicks injury. I think he's someone who can be fantastic. He's one of the better interior defensive linemen in the league. You also have Eddie Goldman and Roy Robinson Harris. Again, I think this is a 10. I don't know what else you could really ask for here. I think that this is I think you have Akeem Hicks by himself is going to give a lot. And I think, you have 2 other players who can be very good next to him. I think this is a 10.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I could probably argue a 9 or an 8 because you want to see Akeem Hicks back fully healthy because, but I think even 80% of what Akeem Hicks was, plus, the rest of that line is probably pretty close to a 10 anyways. But with him fully healthy, I think he's this is definitely a 10 and also one of the best interior defensive lines in football to go along with the edge rushers.
Yeah, I mean, definitely one of the best defensive lines in the league, I think, if not the best. And then we will move on from here and we'll go to the linebackers. And the linebackers, Danny Trevathan and Roquan Smith, both I think are, Pro Bowl level guys. And you also have John Jenkins, who is also a very good, solid veteran player. Again, am I crazy here for saying this is the 3rd straight 10 in a row? I mean, I think that you have two really good linebackers and another one who can definitely be a number 3 guy.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is a high level. This is another one where I could say, you might argue 9 because of the depth behind those guys you question. But at the same time, why are you questioning that when you have 2 of the best in the league? I think, Roquan Smith, 101 tackles in 12 games is pretty nuts. I think this is a high level group. I really like Roquan in the middle there. And yeah, I agree 10.
Okay, yeah. So, and unfortunately, when we get to the secondary, Bears fans, a little bit more disappointing here. Secondary it's got some question marks, I guess. It has some things that are good. I think Kyle Fuller is good. I think Eddie Jackson is obviously very good. After that, there are some question marks. You have Deshaun Gibson, who seems like he'll be their second safety. You also they drafted a couple of cornerbacks in the draft. You have Jalen Johnson and Kendall Vildor. Those were a 2nd and a 5th rounder. I think that there's some good to be had here. I think that obviously they sort of have one good corner, one good safety, and then, a lot of young talents trying to see who can step up. So I'm going to give this a 5.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I guess I do think that the 2 guys are pretty high level. I think Jackson's still Jackson's one of the best safeties in football, which maybe puts it at a 6 or maybe a 7 for me. But I think 5's fair because you got to see what the other side of that secondary is looking. Because outside of Fuller, I do feel like Fuller and Jackson are sure things though.
Yeah, and I also think there's something a little bit different about like a secondary where it's like, if you're if you're talking about the edge rushers and you have one elite edge rusher and one kind of nothing, well, that's still a lot of value. They can still get pressured through that side. But if you have one all-time great cornerback and one terrible cornerback or two terrible cornerbacks, well, then this won't throw to that one guy, and they'll still easily be able to move the ball down the field. So that's kind of it's a question mark with the rookies.
I do think the big thing is too, though, especially for those rookies on that side, they're not going to be asked to do a whole lot because theoretically, these edge rushers are just going to wreak havoc on quarterbacks. So they're not going to have a lot of time to throw anyways. And I do think that's going to be a huge advantage for them in a way that Jackson can really shine because you don't have a lot of time to go through your progressions against this Bears defense.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that. I agree with all of that. So defense, one of the better defenses we will talk about, 8.6, very high. And again, if they had maybe just a couple of corners, this could have even been over a 9. So that means, again, offense 2.8, defense is 8.6. That brings their total to 5.3, which is actually the lowest in this division. But I still think that they're going to end up being better than the Lions simply because I think that the coaching is going to be a huge difference. And, again, I'm a little worried about the Bears offense, but as long as they can just move the ball and get some points, their defense should be good. And again, I can easily see this team. I don't know what their ceiling is, but I wouldn't be shocked if this team wins 8 games next year.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So I put them as a potential playoff team in my division rankings. And I do feel like because, 2 years ago, we did see them be a playoff team. Now, you could argue easily that they maybe overshot themselves that year because maybe this team wasn't a playoff team. They just had a Super Bowl level defense and a subpar level offense, which brings you down a little bit. But so maybe this team is closer to 8-8 than 10-6, but that's a very small margin that the defense and, they create a couple extra turnovers. They get a few extra sacks. Akeem Hicks is healthy. That it's a very small margin between 8-8 and 10-6. So I feel like that there is a potential that they get to that number. But you're probably thinking this team's more like an 8-8 kind of team, I think.
I mean, I don't know if I see them being. I think if I had to predict, I think they go like 6-10. I could even see them like 5-11. Like I think that's my prediction. But I do think that they have, if things work out well for them, things can go back. I just don't trust their offense totally, and I think there are ways to beat their defense because of the young players in their secondary. It's just a big question mark. But I do also think that if they can solve the secondary, this is the team that could end up winning a lot more games.
Yep. So I guess my 2 questions. Oh, sorry. One thing on the Bears. 2 questions on the Bears. 889 yards last season. Do you see David Montgomery hitting 1,000 this year? And do you see Trubisky lasting the season?
Well, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong here. I was assuming Trubisky wouldn't even start the season.
I was assuming he was starting.
Okay, I was just assuming that. I mean, they traded for Nick Foles. I feel like they're probably. I guess maybe that's the better question then. I think that they won't even end up having Trubisky start. I think they'll move on to Nick Foles. So no, I think that's the obvious answer to that. And then Montgomery 1,000 yards. I would say probably. I mean, if you're a number 1 back and you get enough carries, you'll get 1,000 yards. So again, I think their offense could be slightly better with Nick Foles instead of Trubisky. Again, I don't know how much I trust their offensive line, but I'll say yes, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't know. I was kind of assuming Trubisky's still the starter, and Foles is there to make him like kind of nervous. But I mean, we'll see. Who knows at this point?
I don't think we need things to make Trubisky even more nervous. I think enough. There's already enough for that. Okay, so now move on to number 3. Why do you have this team, or I guess second best team in the division? Yeah. Why do you think the third one we're going to talk about? Why do you think I'm assuming it's the Green Bay Packers are going to be second in this division?
Yeah, we probably disagree on this. We'll talk about this. I do have this team at number 2. I struggled going back and forth on where I put this team, whether they're a Super Bowl contender or a playoff contender. And that was mainly because, LaFleur did win some big games. Him and Rodgers did win big games throughout the season. But you look at the numbers, they were 15th in points scored. They were 9th in points against. And their expected wins last year were, actually under 10. They were 9.7 in expected win total. Which is lower than their 13-3 record, obviously. So that's why I had them at number 2. I wasn't really sure that I don't think there's a scenario where this team to me wins a Super Bowl. And, my idea for Super Bowl contenders is very vague, where could I see a realistic scenario where this team makes it to the Super Bowl? I don't really know what that scenario is for the Packers, just because I think that they had the worst offseason in the league. that I think they overshot their 13 wins overshot their expectations last season. And I don't know if this team gets better from last year. So you can go ahead with your spiel. But yeah, I have the Packers at number 2.
Okay. Well, first, let's just ask a clarification question on the Super Bowl contenders. Is it more so like just obviously you're not saying the teams that aren't Super Bowl contenders have no chance to win? Like, for example, when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, I would imagine the year before most people wouldn't have considered them Super Bowl contenders. Just teams like you think that are very much in the mix.
I think the way I see it is that if you told me right now, came back in time and told me right now, this team made the Super Bowl or even won the Super Bowl, would I be shocked? I guess that's the question I had for if you're a Super Bowl contender. And if I'm a little shocked that team's probably making the Super Bowl or winning it, then I probably don't consider them a Super Bowl contender right now. So that's I would kind of be shocked that the Packers are a Super Bowl contender then, because I don't think they're going to hit at the top of the NFC.
I think I would be shocked if someone came back from time and told me anything.
Well, that's true, but I mean, just hypothetically speaking,
right? Gotcha. If you already realized time travel existed and then that happened, yeah, okay.
Yes.
We'll move on to the Packers. First, head coach Matt LaFleur. He gets a 7 right off the bat. It seems again, I had him as the 10th best coach when we did our head coach rankings. So he gets that gives him a 7. It's a high 7, but a 7. Also, Aaron Rodgers. I believe I had him at number 5, which gives him a 9. So 9 for 7 for LaFleur, 9 for Rodgers. What do you think about that?
So you don't think Jordan Love's going to start?
He might. Never know. But yeah, seems unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously I kind of had LaFleur in the coaching rankings. We talked about it a lot on that podcast episode. I had him closer to 15 or 16, I believe, because I said I want to see it again, because there were some wacky stuff I saw him do. Like, Aaron Jones, I think, is a top 5 level running back who is getting bottom 10 level carries, which just didn't make any sense to me. There are some things I didn't like about it, but I think he's a solid coach overall and seems to know what he's doing. I think Mike Pettine's a really good defensive coordinator, and he had that defense doing really well. So I can agree with the 7 overall. And, I made enough of that argument for Rodgers as a top 5 quarterback. I think a 9's fair.
Yeah, we'll get into Aaron Jones in just a second because I kind of disagree. But first, we'll keep going in the order we have been going. For the offensive line, you have Corey Lindsey as their center, Ellington Jenkins, who really had a breakout rookie season last year when he came in for injury and really played very well. You could argue he had the best offensive lineman rookie season last year. Billy Turner is nothing special, but nothing atrocious either. David Bakhtiari, we don't have to talk about him. We already know how great he is. Again, Rick Wagner, okay. I think this offensive line is very good. It's not necessarily like up there with the Cowboys offensive line or the Eagles, I think, but it's just a little bit below that. They get an 8 for me here.
Yeah, I think that there's a bunch of solid players on this, and then Bakhtiari. Oh, excuse me. If you you look at Bakhtiari's numbers, and they just don't make sense. I think he's the best pass blocking lineman in football, or at least best pass blocking tackle in football to me. And he's just so high level at that I think he brings his own line probably a little higher than when it should be to make it probably a top 5 offensive line. Because I do think the other guys are solid and they're good enough, and they've kept Rodgers on his feet most of his career.
Yeah, that's probably fair. Maybe I might be a bit low on him. I might deserve a 9, but again, we'll keep it the same. Won't let you talk. My scores are going to stay the same regardless of how good of points you make. We will then move on to the wide receivers. This is an interesting one, I think, very interesting, because kind of the narrative that gets talked about is that the Packers, they needed some help for Devontae Adams. They disagreed. They did not draft help for Devontae Adams too much. I mean, they did go out and get some help. They have Devontae Adams, obviously. We all agree he's that number 1 guy. The question becomes, who is the number 2 guy? They had Alan Lazard, who has at times taken some pressure off Adams, but he hasn't done it consistently. They also went out and got Devin Funchess, who I kind of feel like is also in that good number 3 guy, not exactly a number 2 guy. You have Jake Camaro and Marquez Valdez-Scantling, so they have depth here. The real question is, do they have a number 2 guy? I think no. So to me, I think that's the one thing they're missing. And so they fall down to a 6 because of that.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. Like, if you individually grade Adams, he's probably a 9.5 or a 10, depending on
Hmm.
how you rank wide receivers. He's that good, but he's gonna face double teams every week. Um, and we were kind of, one of the things, you're kind of on the fence about Anthony Miller. I think the Packers would kill to have Anthony Miller right now as their number
Hmm.
two guy. I think
Yeah.
he'd be way better than any of these guys. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think it's a 6, and you could probably talk me down to a 5 because depth is nice, but you need to have someone at the top of that depth that you feel really confident about. And if you look at 2 through 6, it's a bunch of guys that's like, yeah, I guess, but it's not like I'm going to feel great that they're there.
Hmm.
That's kind of how I feel about everyone, including Lazard. And a guy like Funchess had, I think, one good year his career. So
Hmm.
we'll see what happens with him. I'm not big on him at all. I don't think anyone's
Yeah.
really high on him. So,
Hmm.
but
Oh man, the Devin Funchess stands are gonna come at you
yeah,
now, Kyle.
everybody watch out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fair. I think it's a bunch of guys who can run setup routes very well, and Devontae Adams who can get open by himself. So I think that's kind of their wide receiving grouping. So I had their O line as an 8 and their wide receivers a 6. You would probably give the wide receivers a 5 and the O line a 9. So we're still kind of on the same page here. We'll
Yeah.
move on to the backs now. You have Aaron Jones, and we'll get into this. But they also have Jamal Williams, who actually I don't think you're very high on. I thought he played fine last year. I thought he was a fine backup. And they went out and they drafted A.J. Dillon in the second round. It's hard to have too much negative to say about the backs. I think they get a 10.
Yeah, I do. Though I guess the one thing I do feel like is that I feel like the AJ Dillon thing was a little weird. Drafting him right now, like I didn't see the point.
Mm-hmm.
Did they forget that they needed a second wide receiver at the time? I don't. I guess you could throw him on the goal line and say he's big enough to do that. The Williams, I do feel like every time he's out there, I'm kind of just okay. That's fine. I guess he's kind of how I feel about Sony Michel because I have to bring everything back to the Patriots. He doesn't break a lot of tackles for me. He doesn't do a lot of things that I really love. He's just kind of out there, and I think he's solid. I think that Aaron Jones is a game-changing level guy who was first in the league in touchdowns. And what was he in yards? He was 12th in yards, first in touchdowns, and 15th in carries. And I think he's a guy that is a game-changing level player who's just not getting the touches that I think he needs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when you phrase it that way, it does make sense. But I think what I would disagree with, and for one thing, I mean, hey, Sony Michel as a backup. If you're comparing him to Sony Michel and that's their backup, I think that's pretty good, or maybe even third string. That's very good. But I think my thing with Aaron Jones is like the Packers were winning game after game after game. So why run your star running back into the ground if you're winning these games? Let's, preserve him to some degree. Let's not have him. Let's not only get, a couple years of him and then Todd Gurley him out of the league. Let's, supplement him with other backs so that way we can still have some success running the ball, but then, use him in the most prominent ways. I think that makes sense to me. The goal isn't to get the most rushing yards throughout the course of a season. The goal is to win a Super Bowl.
That's fair, but I also feel like at the same time, the best, he's had over 20 carries twice last season. And in those 2 games, he went 25 carries, 100 yards, 23 carries, 154, and 2 touchdowns. I do think he's a good guy I think he's a guy that does really well with production, and he's just not seeing it. And I think a lot of their losses were also due to the fact that he didn't get the numbers that he needed. You look at some of the games that he played, they played bad on, and a lot of it was because he wasn't getting the ball. And I do think that there is a significant difference where you can make the difference on a team with, having that sort of production and a workload.
Again, I don't know if I don't know how long I want to spend on this, but I don't know if I totally agree again, because I say like, we'll use the 49ers example game, for example. It's like the running game wasn't getting anything going because the 49ers defensive line was so good. So it's like, what do you do if you don't just keep running the ball if it keeps getting you 0 yards? At a certain point, you do have to not abandon it, but start passing the ball much more. So I think there was always reasons for when they didn't run the ball as much. I mean, listen, you might be right to some degree. Maybe they should have given him more handoffs, but I don't think it's like this horrendous thing that they're just, not being smart on whatsoever.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I'm probably just a little worked up over it. I also had him in fantasy football, which made it even more frustrating.
Yeah, got it.
But I do think that he is a high level running back. Obviously, you can go back and forth on that forever, but I do think that he is. I still feel like he's one of the top maybe not 5, but I could probably argue top 8 guys in football in terms of that position. I just think he's that good.
Yeah, no. Again, we both agree. Aaron Jones is great. That's why I gave him a 10. And regardless of how much they get used, he gets used. They deserve a 10 for just the talent they have there, and that's what I'm evaluating it on. What they deserve a poor grade for is tight ends, because it seems like, again, them with the Bears, not really sure exactly what their plan is here. It seems like, Joshua Derriga, I believe his name is, who is a 3rd-round pick. Maybe he's going to be the guy. They also have a 36-year-old Mercedes Lewis. Again, there's a little bit here, perhaps, but it is not a lot. I'm giving them a 2, and it's closer to a 1 than a 3.
Yeah, I'd probably put it at a 1. I was just looking at Mercedes Lewis. I'm surprised. I could have sworn he was like 147 years old. It's so surprising to see, and he has the most production on this team. The other guys are so big question marks. I have no idea.
Yeah, a 3rd-round rookie, and rookies tight ends tend to not do well, and then a 36-year-old. Again, maybe they will find some value, and that's the only thing keeping it above a 1, but that's not a great situation to be in, where it's like, hey, maybe we won't totally suck. The one thing I do have to say, though, is that I don't think they're going to be using I think when they're going to be running pass plays, they're not going to use many tight ends. I don't think they really need good receiving tight ends, which is probably part of what what the idea is here. So maybe that's part of it. I think it's easy. Again, tight ends are one of those positions that it's easy to hide. But as a whole, even with that poor tight end group, the rest of their offense is good enough that they get a 7.0 on offense.
Yeah, I think that's fair overall. I think that this is a solid offense that's always going to be good.
Okay, and now we'll move on to the defense, and we'll double up the defensive line here a little bit. So edge rushers, you have the 2 guys they signed last year, Preston Smith and Zadarius Smith. Both played very well. You also have Rashawn Gary, who they drafted in the 1st round. Didn't show a lot, but was also not given a ton of playing time. And again, one of the positions that tends to take some time to develop is when you are a big defensive lineman. That size sometimes is a little bit difficult. But with Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith, I think they still get a 9 here. And also with the interior defensive line, Kenny Clark is a monster. But other than that, a little bit of worries here, especially when they like to play 3-4. Tyler Lancaster, Dean Lowry. Again, this is probably a little bit higher if they played 4-3, but considering the fact that they're going to probably need 3 of these guys to play consistently, I'm giving them a 6.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's, they kind of run that, almost 5 guys on the defensive line with the 2 Smiths. I think that's a high level group. They had a terrific season last year, and we're 2 of the best signings last year for those 2. And I do think that Gary is a guy that gets better. He was, a huge high school prospect that I think is going to put it together eventually. I just think he has too much talent, too much size. And I think the interior defensive line, Kenny Clark's a guy that brings that group up. We kind of talked about it with Adams, a few other position groups as we go through this. When you have a guy that you grade individually as a 10, but the rest of it's probably like a 3, then I think 6 is fair.
Yeah. Okay. And then for the linebackers, I almost said for number and then gave away the number. Again, it's interesting here because I think that they're very much probably only going to play 1 linebacker throughout a course of. I think they're going to probably play a lot of a ton of nickel, and they're going to with the 3-4, they're not going to have in terms of middle linebackers. It seems that Christian Kirksey is the guy they're hoping can be successful, but again, he can never stay healthy. So it's a lot of eggs in your basket of a guy who can stay healthy. You have Martin, who is a 5th rounder, Camille, something like that. He was a 5th rounder they drafted. So, maybe some depth there. But I mean, it seems like they're putting a lot of eggs into their basket that Kirksey can be healthy. But if he can, then they have a very good linebacker. And they don't need a ton. So I'm giving them a 3 because I don't love their depth. And I also don't trust Kirksey to stay healthy. But if he does, they do have potential to be very good, in a much better shape.
Yeah, you almost, my write-up here is essentially with a healthy Kirksey and one of these rookie or young linebackers working out, this could be a 6 or a 7. If Kirksey is unhealthy and, of course, none of these young linebackers work out, then this is probably like a 2. Because I do feel like that Kirksey he's played 9 games in the last 2 years, I think it was. So that's just such a huge question mark, especially for a guy you're relying on to be the number 1 guy on that linebacker group.
Yeah, agreed. And then we'll move on to the secondary. Secondary is interesting. I mean, you have Jair Alexander, who the Green Bay Packers fan base is very split on, but I think he's pretty good. Maybe a bit overrated, but pretty good. Kevin King, solid number two guy. I would say good number two guy. And even Sullivan, who's a solid number three guy, and I would even say good number three guy. And on top of that, for their safeties, Darnell Savage and Adrian Amos, the former division rival Chicago Bears. Not a lot bad here. I'm going to give them an 8.
Yeah, I think that this is a good secondary. I guess the argument you make is that there's no one that's like a star in the secondary, but I don't think it really matters with the pressure that the Smiths can bring. You don't need a superstar back there. I think you just need guys who are good in coverage, make smart plays. They're going to run a lot of five or six defensive backs out there, and I think a lot of these guys can just cover really well. I think that they're solid overall over there in the back.
Yeah, so with that, it gives the Packers their defense to 6.5, their offense was 7.0, so that brings their total to 6.8. And I actually feel like this is kind of one of those examples that I think that my grading system kind of disrupts it a little bit, just because their two biggest reasons why they're farther down are because of their linebacking group and their tight end group, is the fact, and those aren't necessarily two incredibly important positions. So I personally feel like they're probably, this is the same grading system. This is the same score that the Cowboys got. I think they're a better team than the Cowboys because I think they have plans to sort of fix their two biggest weaknesses.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about your grading system. I think there almost needs to be some sort of level, like a variability rating for if you have a 9 at quarterback, obviously that's more important than having a 9 on the offensive line to be in a really successful team. I do think that there is some variability to, some position ratings obviously should make you higher than other position ratings, but I do feel like this is the question I have with the Packers at the same time. There are a few things that I could see this linebacking group just getting absolutely crushed. And I could see teams, I could see a lot of teams just having a lot of success running the ball on this team because of that. And I do think that I don't know what the ceiling is for this team or what this team can be, because there are a lot of questions throughout the roster that I have, whether it's receiver, tight end, linebacker. So I'm like, is this really going to be a 13-win team again? Do I see that happening, or do I see like maybe a 9 or 10-win team?
Okay, well, I'll real quick, I'll give you here's how the Packers win the Super Bowl next year. Here's how it works. They become a very run-heavy team. Their third-round tight end ends up being very solid blocking tight end, which can now allow them to and they already have a good offensive line and good halfbacks. A lot of the pressure is off Rodgers. They don't have to worry too much about receivers getting open in terms of the number 2 receivers by themselves, because the rest of the receivers do a good enough job at just running, setup routes that can get guys open. Their defense becomes very good. Kirksey stays healthy, bringing them to a top tier defense, and and then Mahomes gets injured for the season. That's how the Packers can win the Super Bowl in 2020.
Interesting. That's a lot of ifs.
There's no team that there's no ifs if they to win a Super Bowl.
I do feel like the Chiefs kind of like, if Patrick Mahomes, I guess that is an if, but Patrick Mahomes wins the Chiefs a Super Bowl. I don't think there's an if to that. I think it's just, he's that good. I do think that the one thing that, we kind of crushed this receiving group, especially after Adams. I do think the one thing that we didn't talk about is that, for as much as I don't like Williams and like Jones, what things that they both do very well is catch out of the backfield, and Rodgers uses them both a lot. And I think that they're going to use that as well. And, that's going to be their way to try and make up that number 2 receiver, is by using those running backs a lot.
Yeah. I would say the Packers are a Super Bowl contender using the same, using the same sort of method that you've used. I would say they are, but fair enough. And we'll move on to the Minnesota Vikings, a team you said they were a Super Bowl contender, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And running a little bit long, but that's fine. This is a good show, I think. We'll start off with the two most important, the coach and quarterback. Mike Zimmer, he gets a 7. Kirk Cousins, he gets a 6.
Yeah, I think that 6 is probably fair for Cousins. I think he is average. I think that, he's probably the worst you can get for a potential team that wins the Super Bowl. he was a Pro Bowler last year, was his best year. The question is going to be, can he keep that up without his deep threat, as we'll get into the receivers? But I do think he is good enough. And then Zimmer, is the best defensive coach in football. Is that a debate? Is it close?
Well, Belichick's pretty good.
Well, yeah, Belichick. He's a complete coach, I think, in my book. I do think in terms of just coaching defense, I feel like Zimmer and Belichick got to be 1-2. And I would probably put Zimmer 1 in my book.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple you could probably think about, but yeah, I mean, you could almost maybe even throw Greg Williams into the mix. He will never get a head coaching job, but he's fantastic. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, I would probably put him at number 2 I would put him at number 2. Yeah, great defensive coach, but again, also a lot more to being a head coach than just X's and O's. So, but yeah, again, I think he was like number 11 on my coaching list, something like that. So he gets the 7. In the same group that LaFleur was in. And then for the offensive line, this is not a disaster as it has been in past, but still needs some work. Garrett Bradbury, I actually am higher on than a lot of people are on. I thought that his pass protection isn't great, but he's a center and you can hide that. And he's a very good run blocker. So I think I'm higher on him than most people. Pat Eflin, and Dakota Dozer, they do not have easy names to pronounce. Yeah. As the guards, Dozier not very good. Not much needs to be said. Tackle play isn't terrible. With Brian O'Neill and Riley Reef. Definitely want to make sure I don't mispronounce that one. I would say that their offensive line receives a 4.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I did consider this team a Super Bowl contender, and I would probably consider this group the one part of the team where I feel like if this kind of blows up in their face, this is the reason they don't win the Super Bowl. Even more so than Kirk Cousins, I think that there's a lot of questions on this group. But I do feel like at least, with a zone blocking scheme, you don't need any like superstar offensive linemen. It's a pretty straightforward blocking scheme, I think, in my book, in terms of that zone running scheme. And then it's a lot of play action, which is supposed to catch everybody with a surprise. So I think that it could be. I think there's no great players on the offensive line, but I don't think they necessarily need to be great.
Yeah, just pointing this out, I actually had 2 spots that are lower than the offensive line on my ranking. But yeah, I kind of agree. It's not a great spot. And I think I care more about offensive line than you might. So that might also be a little bit why we have a bit of a disparity between Vikings and Packers. We'll move on to the wide receivers. Adam Thielen is a number 1 guy, in my opinion. I think Justin Jefferson should easily be the number 3 guy. And I think Tajay Sharp could easily be Jefferson could be a number 2 guy. And I think Tajay Sharp could be a number 3 guy. This is a 7 for me. I think it's kind of like, good. It's not quite on that like elite tier, but still I think very good. You can't complain about your wide receivers.
Yeah, I think, Thielen, I think when healthy is a high level guy. I think that, he played 10 games last year, which obviously was the lowest. But before that, he was 91 catches, 113 catches in back-to-back years, which, is elite level receiving. And the question for me when it comes to this receiving group is, are they going to find that deep threat? I think Stephon Diggs, not only being a really good receiver, Stephon Diggs, as I've said multiple times on this, was one of the best deep threat receivers in football the past couple of years. And if they're going to have one of these guys step up and be able to take the lid off the top of this offense and extend a lot of these defenses out to open up the holes for their run game.
Yeah, I miss Case Keenum just going full effort and chuck it with the with Thielen and Diggs. That was fun. But yeah, good stuff there. We'll move on to the backs. I am going to just assume that Dalvin Cook does not hold out because I don't know how to predict that. So I'm just going to go with that. I think Dalvin Cook is fantastic when healthy. It's important to, again, you talk about the guys who part of their last name becomes when healthy because he is someone you kind of have to say that with. Alexander Madison, very good too. I think if they are both healthy, this is a 10 situation. But because of Cook's injury, I am knocking them down a point. They get a 9 for me.
Yeah, and I don't hate Mike Boone either, who's the number 3 guy. He had almost 6 yards of carry too, and very limited production, but I thought he was solid overall. And then, Cook, he played 14 games last year, but obviously he's had the injury troubles throughout his first 3 years, which is the big question. But, I don't think it was a stretch even with Derrick Henry to say that he was the best pure runner in football. I still think McCaffrey was probably the best running back in football, or is probably the best running back in football. I think Barkley's up there as well. But in terms of runners, it wouldn't be so far to say he's better than Henry, and right there with Elliott as the best pure runner in football when healthy.
Yeah. And I would also throw Nick Chubb into the mix. I think what he was able to do with a bad Browns offensive line was spectacular. I would still put McCaffrey as number one. Again, we can do a whole podcast on best running backs, but also I forgot to mention CJ Ham, good, I would say above average fullback for them. So that also factors in. And then we'll move on to the tight ends. Tight ends are interesting for me. You have Kyle Rudolph, who the perception of Rudolph is that he's good pass catcher, but doesn't really block too much. I think that's a bit overblown. I think he's a fine blocker. Although definitely he excels at pass catching. You also have Irv Smith Jr., who's a very good backup. He's kind of the guy who, when you put in, there's no way for the defense to know what's coming because he can pretty much do it all pretty well. I'd give this a 7.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 7's probably fair. I could probably argue 8. Obviously, we won't go back and forth on a point. I think Rudolph is a better blocker than he's given credit for. I think he has great size over there. And, his receiving numbers don't ever really blow you away. And I think a lot of that has to also do with kind of the Vikings don't throw the ball a whole lot in this new offense, this offense they're running. So he's not asked to do a whole lot receiving wise, but I think he's obviously, when he needs to be, he's a high level receiving target at tight end. So I would put that at 7, maybe an 8, but overall I think that they're very good.
Yeah. And then from that, offense, not a whole lot wrong here, except for the offensive line. They get a solid 8 for their offense. And from that, we can move on to their edge rusher, or the defense. We'll start with edge rushers. You have Danielle Hunter and Ifeadi Ndegbo, who was great last year, or not great, but he was, he really, for a number 3 guy, was definitely very good. And so they said, we're going to move you up to the number 2 guy because he played very well. And Danielle Hunter, one of the premier guys in the league. I'm not quite sure I'm going to give this a 10, but I do believe it gets a 9 here.
Yeah, I mean, the edge rushing groups in this division are just insane. I think we had 6, 10, 10, and 9. This is really a high level, and this is, a high level defensive line that's losing Everson Griffin because they, because of a guy like, I'm botching his name right. Ndegbo. Yeah. So a guy like him is obviously good enough to take, say, oh, we don't need Everson Griffin anymore. We're not going to worry about it. So I think that's a big thing. And I do think that this is a high level defensive line. Hunter's obviously a big time game changer as well.
Yeah. So I really like those guys. Interior D-line, a bit of a question mark. I do think Michael Pierce is good. I don't think he's I don't know how good I'm going to be willing to call him. You also have Shamar Stephen and J.L. Johnson, who are nothing special in my opinion. This is one of the categories I gave them a lower grade than the offensive line. This gets a 3 for me. I'm not really blown away by this.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I think that, Pierce is probably average. If he takes another leap forward, maybe, then you could probably grade this out to like a 5 or a mid-tier level interior group. But you have to see that level of production from him. I don't think he's anything more than solid.
Yeah, and I think the good thing about this is the next category, the linebackers who aren't edge rushers. It's going to be Eric Kendricks, Anthony Barr, and Eric Wilson. I mean, this is clear-cut 10 out of 10, I think.
Yeah, I think that, of course, I do think that this is probably one of the best 2 or 3 linebacking groups in the country, or in the NFL, probably number 1. I'm going back and forth on college football and NFL verbiage here. But yeah, okay. I think guys like him and, Kendricks and Barr obviously bring this group to a 10, and Wilson's very good in his own right as well.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not really too worried about their interior defensive line because they have great edge rushers and they have linebackers who will still do a good enough job of stopping the run. I don't think you have to be too worried about that. What I do think that the biggest worry, and maybe the biggest worry that Vikings fans should have going into the season in general, is going to be their secondary. I mean, you have, Mike Hughes, who was a first-round pick, hyped up to some degree, but hasn't been particularly great since coming to Minnesota. You also have Jeff Gladney, who they drafted. I'm not too high on him. The more tape I watch of him, I'm not as big of a fan of him. They also drafted Cameron Dantzler in the 3rd round. I don't. In terms of their cornerbacks, I think that there's definitely some things to be a bit bit worried about, to say the least. Obviously Anthony Harris and Harrison Smith. That's the flip side. I'm a little conflicted on this because I do think that their safeties are good, but I don't know how great of their secondary is. I think their secondary is it's a big question mark. And so their corners are a big question mark. So I'm still giving them a 3, even though I think you could argue they have one of the best safeties tandems in the league. Because again, I'm focusing it more on, how well will this entire group do towards helping their team next year, and I think it could be a big weakness.
Yeah, I'm almost inclined to just say 5 because I feel like the safeties are a 10 and the corners are a 1. But I think you say it right that, if you work all the pieces together, a really good wide receiver could torch this group despite the numbers on the secondary. Now, of course, if Gladney sort of works out to where, he was drafted and a guy like Mike Hughes, I think that I liked him, obviously a UCF guy, I was really rooting for him. I liked him a lot when he first came out and he was looking pretty good, then had that knee injury his rookie year. Then he kind of came back last year. Maybe he gets some of that underneath him and he starts to move on and be like a mid-level production guy. And so that turns into 2 solid cornerbacks. But you got to see it from both of those guys. And obviously, if you're not seeing it from either of those guys yet, you can't really grade it anything more than a 1 at corner, where I think that safeties are just that high level. And, how much can good safeties make up for bad corners is the question. I think that corner is the more important position in my book. Obviously, you can go back and forth on that. I think a good free safety can make a huge difference, but I think good corners make up for bad safeties more than good safeties make up for bad corners. That's just my opinion on the defense. So I do think that brings it down probably to a 4 or a 3.
Yeah, and I should also probably mention Holton Hill, who has been solid in a small sample size. So, maybe him or Hughes can be like a solid contributor, but I just see no guy in their cornerback room that can honestly take away like a Devontae Adams one-on-one. I mean, they'll probably double team him, but like for the Lions with Marvin Jones and Galladay, it's like I don't think they can successfully take away both of those guys. So that's my concern with them. I do think they have weaknesses. I don't think this is the perfect team. But that being said, I still have their defense as a 6.25, brings their total to a 7.2, which is the highest total that I've given out so far. So yeah, I mean, I still think the Packers probably win the division. My reasoning for that is because I think the Packers' biggest weaknesses are linebacker and tight end, whereas the Vikings' biggest weaknesses are offensive line and secondary, which I would probably say that on defense, secondary, the least place I would rather have a defense would, with a secondary, the place I would least like to have a bad thing happen would be secondary. What am I saying? Let me try this again. On defense, the place
cornerback is more important than linebacker.
Yeah, essentially. I think that second. My point is that quarterback's the most important position, and then I would probably say offensive line and secondary would be my next highest on each of those 2 sides. So that's why I feel like those. That's why I would say that the Packers will still win the division, even though I do think these are 2 very good teams.
Yeah, I do feel like these teams are almost neck and neck. I do feel like that the Vikings have a more complete roster, and I think the rankings kind of prove that. I do think that this team, I don't think. Would you be shocked if this team made the Super Bowl?
Shocked is probably the wrong word, but I would be. I don't expect them to. I would not put them as one of my Super Bowl contenders teams.
I don't know. I just feel like over the last few years, they've been one of those teams that have been right there, whether it was the Eagles season, last season, they obviously beat the Saints. I feel like that was a very good team. And I do feel a scenario where, they get to the playoffs, whether it's 10-6, 11-5, and then they just kind of do what Tennessee did last year, and they're going to just ride Derrick Henry through those 3 playoff games. And I feel like Cook is at that level where he could kind of make that work and just bring this team to the level where they're potentially playing in an NFC Championship game or even making the Super Bowl, and probably losing to Patrick Mahomes, but at that level where they can compete at the highest level with almost any other team.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the Packers, I just checked. Both teams ended up losing to the 49ers by exactly 17 points, which is kind of interesting. And I actually feel like the Packers were more in that game than the Vikings were in their game. I feel like there was just no chance of the Vikings being able to beat a team that had a great pass rush like that. And the chances are, if they make it to the playoffs again, they're going to face someone with a great pass rush, or they're going to face someone with a great receiving core. And I don't think they can beat either of those teams. So again, it's sometimes in football, a lot of it is just like, how do you, are you going to lose to a team that has this kind of thing? A lot of it becomes matchups. And I still stand by, I think a large reason the Titans were able to win was because they just matched up very well, both against New England and against Baltimore, because I think their secondary was kind of suspect and because it was banged up with injuries. And then when they finally played the Chiefs, it showed that, as the Chiefs were able to torch their secondary for the most part. I don't know. I think that there's a higher percent chance. I think the Packers are a better team. I think that their weaknesses are not as strong, and I think their strengths are better. I think that, sure, the Vikings, you could argue, hey, they have Dalvin Cook, but I mean, I think Aaron Jones is better, and he stays healthier, and their offensive line is better, and their quarterback is better. So I just think that there's so much more going for the Packers than the Vikings.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably fair. I just think in terms, so my Super Bowl contender list, I do think that the Vikings and potentially the Packers, because I had them right on that line, is like, is this a Super Bowl team or not? I think those were my two worst Super Bowl contenders that I had, that I was debating between. And ultimately, I just feel like that the top level talent of the Vikings is good enough to put that team in the Super Bowl rather than the Packers, whether on both sides of the ball. I do think that this defense is really high level. Despite the cornerbacks, you can question them, but I do feel like at the end of the day, if Gladney does work out to maybe what they're hoping for, obviously he's a rookie corner, so, you can't expect him to be a Pro Bowler his first year. But I do think if he works out to a solid corner, Hughes gets back, I do think then, you're debating if this is the best defense in the league and potentially, beating up on everybody if their corners can be good enough.
Yeah, I just think that's going to be that's a big, again, a wise man once said, that's a lot of ifs. I think that's maybe not a lot of ifs, but that's a big one. I mean, the idea of a first round, a rookie corner turning into like a number one corner, it's happened before. Lattimore did it. It's very rare. I think we both given our points pretty well at this point. But yeah, that's sort of where I stand. And I think that, fair enough, we'll have to agree to disagree. And again, I would be shocked if the Vikings win their division. I would be shocked if they won. I was surprised if they won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think our on the sidelines listeners will have to follow this one and can make fun of either one of us, to whoever's right, whether it's the Packers or the Vikings winning out this one.
No, they never. They're the nicest fan base we have. No trolls whatsoever in the comments below.
Yeah.
All right. So that's our show. Hey, in just over 2.5 hours is my birthday, Kyle. What do you think of that?
Oh yeah, happy birthday! Are you doing anything exciting during quarantine crisis?
Not really. Not really. Yeah, it's the quarantine. There's not really a lot of. You can't really do much for a birthday. Nothing too exciting, but it should be fun. And I have a Joe Flacco video ready to post for tomorrow in celebration of me. So That should be fun. Yeah. But yeah, again, everyone, thanks for watching. Kyle, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think this division will be very interesting, and of course, happy birthday, co-host, and this will be fun to watch this next season. I think there's a lot of really competitive teams in this group.
Yeah, should be fun. And until next time, we're going to be doing the NFC West. So until next time, have a good one.
All right.